Hira, 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 hira. Hira, hira, hira. Hira, 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 hira. Hira, 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 hira. Hira, 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 hira. Hira, hira, hira. Hira, hina, 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 hina. Hira, 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 hira. Hira, 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 hina, hina. Hina, hina, hina. Hira, hina, 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 hina. Hira, 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 hira. Hira, 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 hira. Hira, hira, hira. Hira, 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 hira. Hira, 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 hira. Ya, ya, hira, hira, hira. Hira, 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 hira. Hina, 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 hina. Hina, 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 hina. Hina, 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 hina. Hina, hina, hina. Hina, 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 hina. Hira, 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 hira. Hira, 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 hira. Hina, hina, hina. Shalom, shalom, beautiful friends. It's great to see you. That was the melody for Imish Kachech, Yerushalayim. If we forget Yerushalayim, if we forget Jerusalem, fits in with this week and the 9 days of mourning leading up to Tisha B'Av this coming Sunday, as we all continue to think about how to bring light to dark spaces, how to bring healing where there's brokenness, how to continue to rebuild rather than tear down. And we all have our own ways of pursuing that. And I wish you all continued strength and solidarity in that mission, however you understand it. So today's topic is mob mentality. And I would love to start with a poll question, as you probably expected. How do you feel in large crowds? Do you feel excited and energized? Do you feel shy and nervous? Do you feel the same you feel in small groups? Now, of course, it depends what kind of large crowd you're in. Are you at a political rally? Are you at a Taylor Swift concert? Because I'm sure you all go to those. Are you in a very crowded Costco? Where are you? And so how do you feel in large crowds? Okay, 33% are excited and energized. 50% are shy and nervous. 17% feel the same as in small groups. Okay, so if I'm at a large VBM lecture, or if I'm at something that's energizing that I love or something, I feel excited. And if I'm at, an airport or, a bus station, if there's such things anymore, other like, then I feel more intimidated. Okay, friends, let's dive in. There's a lot to cover today. Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by any irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct. That is White Rose, Resistance Group leaflet from 1942. Mob mentality is a formidable phenomenon that can eclipse personal judgment, pulling individuals into the emotional tides of a collective. In the presence of a crowd, both psychological and physical factors can lead even the most rational people to lose their individuality, blending into a shared mindset that can be unpredictable and potentially hazardous. This phenomenon compels individuals to behave in ways that would typically avoid when alone, driven by heightened emotions, a weakened sense of self, and the powerful sway of group dynamics. As feelings escalate, whether fueled by anger, excitement, or fear, rational thought diminishes, making it more likely for individuals to conform to the group rather than think for themselves. This transformation can take many forms, from violent demonstrations and unruly celebrations to tragic crowd crushes, highlighting how swiftly personal autonomy can be engulfed by collective actions. When individuals become part of a crowd, they undergo a significant psychological transformation. The anonymity provided by large groups leads to a diffusion of responsibility. Personal accountability fades as one's identity blends into the collective. Indeed, the psychological impulse of being part of a group creates the perception that violence or unacceptable behavior is not a personal responsibility, but a group one. This process of de-individuation diminishes inhibitions and critical thought, allowing behaviors that are usually restrained to surface. In this state, an individual's moral compass is temporarily realigned to resonate with the prevailing energy of the group, whether it's positive or negative. To that point, French psychologist Gustave Le Bon commented that the masses have never thirsted after truth. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. The contagion of emotion with crowds operates through multiple channels of unconscious communication. From a physical standpoint, neurons in the brain activate as we observe others' emotional states, automatically synchronizing our physiological responses. This neurological mirroring creates cascading waves of shared feeling, whether panic, ecstasy, or fury, that spread exponentially faster than rational thought processes can intervene. At critical density thresholds, this emotional transmission combines with physical forces to create a fluid-like crowd dynamic where individual agency becomes physically impossible. The power of social proof is crucial in understanding crowd behavior. Humans possess an evolutionary disposition to follow majority actions, particularly in ambiguous or high-stress situations. This adaptive strategy, which served our ancestors well when detecting predators or finding resources, becomes dangerously amplified in modern mass gatherings. When uncertainty strikes, the brain takes cognitive shortcuts, assuming collective movement must indicate legitimate danger or opportunity. Shared identity further intensifies mob psychology. When individuals unite under a common cause, ideology, or experience, the boundaries between self and other can blur. This psychological fusion creates a powerful feedback loop where the crowd's energy becomes self-reinforcing. The resulting collective effervescence, a term coined by sociologist Emil Durkheim, provides an intoxicating sense of connection and purpose that can override individual ethical boundaries. Indeed, when people are in the state of collective effervescence, there's an intensification of the mutual focus of attention and shared mood as individuals become rhythmically entrained, feeding off others' responses with greater rhythm and with heightened emotions. Such an intense transformation can explain how ordinary citizens can participate in acts of destruction or violence that would be unthinkable in their daily life. One of the most significant psychological impacts of being part of a crowd is the diminishment of personal identity. In the presence of a large group, individuals can experience a decreased sense of accountability for their actions, as their individual identities become obscured by the collective. This phenomenon, referred to as de-individuation, leads to a reduction in self-awareness, making individuals more prone to engage in behaviors that they would typically refrain from. Within a crowd, the likelihood of being recognized or held personally accountable diminishes, which can encourage individuals to take risks or act contrary to societal expectations. For instance, during protests or riots, individuals who would ordinarily refrain from vandalism or violence may participate in such actions due to the perceived protection offered by the crowd's size. The diffusion of responsibility results in no single individual feeling entirely responsible for the group's conduct, thereby facilitating the justification of destructive actions. This effect is amplified when individuals don masks, face coverings, or team colors, which further obscure personal identity and enhance feelings of anonymity. I always dread when I'm in one of these mass rallies when someone, does something stupid, because it will reflect on the whole group. It will now be in the press a violent rally. It will now be, there's now going to be a response from the police presence that was different than planned for. And so there's no way to really regulate that. Organizers sometimes try, but oftentimes these things are a little bit of anarchy. Although initial participant intention may not include destructive outcomes, immersion in crowd dynamics facilitates rapid behavioral escalation. The psychological phenomenon of de-individuation serves as a primary mechanism in this transformation. Upon integration into collective gatherings, individuals experience diminished personal identity salience and accountability cognition. The crowd environment generates psychological anonymity that enables behavioral disinhibition that not typically observed in isolated contexts. This process often involves a detachment from personal value systems, a mental justification of harmful behaviors, and a sense of being shielded from the repercussions of one's actions. The anonymity provided by being part of a group shifts extreme behaviors such as vandalism, theft, or challenging authority from personal moral choices to elements of a collective movement. The emotional intensity typical of civil unrest can overpower individual self-control, turning vague feelings of frustration into tangible actions, which frequently lead to lasting impacts on society. Interestingly, mob mentality isn't solely fueled by anger. It can also stem from intense excitement, especially following significant sports wins or losses. When a team faces defeat, emotions can escalate quickly, transforming frustration into aggression. Fans might unleash their anger on rival fans, law enforcement, or even on their own city, something I've never understood until researching this, resulting in fights, property destruction, and riots. Equally notable is the chaos that erupts when a team triumphs. That I understood even less until studying this. Instead of expressing disappointment, fans often celebrate in ways that can spiral out of control, setting fires, overturning cars, and flooding the streets in a wild frenzy. The collective emotional experience of a major victory or defeat heightens the intensity of individual actions. Even those who typically avoid destructive behavior can find themselves swept up in the moment, driven by the collective energy of the crowd. Wouldn't you think you love your city, you love the sports team of your city that won, you're going to go plant some flowers and give some hugs? No, people are like, let's go drink beer and start a fire, right? These are not my friends. I know Gary Friedlander does that for fun after his teams win, but fortunately he lives in cities where the teams don't win. A clear example of this occurred in Philadelphia after the Eagles won the Super Bowl in 2018. City officials, anticipating an unruly celebration if the team was victorious, went so far as to coat utility poles with hydraulic fluid to prevent people from climbing them. I mean, how crazy are we as Americans? I mean, it's not just Americans. The whole world does this, unfortunately. Despite the preventative efforts, fans took over the streets, scaling traffic lights, overturning vehicles, and looting stores, all in a state of jubilance. A similar scene played out when the LA Dodgers won the World Series, with crowds lighting fireworks, blocking traffic, and engaging in standoffs with police. In both cases, what began as collective joy quickly escalated into lawlessness. These events highlight how euphoria, combined with the energy of a crowd, can break down personal restraint in the same way anger does. But most vitally, fans might be emboldened by the anonymity of a crowd provides, as reported by the New York Times in an analysis on post-sports victory behavior. The sheer size of the group fosters a sense of anonymity, making individuals feel like they are part of something bigger, which lowers their inhibitions and fuels reckless behavior. This pattern isn't unique to America. International sports riots have led to large-scale destruction, especially in soccer cultures where emotions run deep. In places like Brazil, England, and Argentina, post-game riots have resulted in injuries, deaths, and widespread property damage. Some of the most violent, isn't it great when other countries do stupid stuff and not just Americans? Like, I feel like so not not as ashamed as when just Americans do dumb stuff. Some of the most violent incidents have erupted after high-stakes matches where national pride and deep-seated rivalries intensify emotions. Fans, often intoxicated and highly emotional, can quickly turn a celebration or disappointment into destruction. Whether the crowd is celebrating a victory or mourning a loss, the psychology remains the same. Once emotions reach a certain intensity, rational thinking fades, and the group moves as one unpredictable force. Law enforcement and event organizers have tried various strategies to prevent these outbreaks, from increasing police presence to enforcing curfews, but the power of collective emotion remains difficult to control. Sarah, there's so much I know about you, and Sarah, there's so much I don't know about you. But one of the things I know is that you're not starting fires after sports games. I just have a good hunch about that about you. The soccer riot between Israeli and Dutch fans in 2024 illustrates how swiftly mob mentality can emerge, a phenomenon extensively explored in psychological studies. What began as a heated yet standard match between Israeli and Dutch teams quickly escalated as tensions among fans intensified. Cheers and taunts rapidly devolved into physical altercations, with objects being thrown, barriers breached, and fights erupting in the stands. And so I don't sound wishy-washy here. These Israeli fans who flew there and were overly nationalistic were being really stupid. Nonetheless, there was a deep anti-Semitic attack that happened there that was violent, was one way violent, and was deeply troubling and disappointing what erupted from that. When law enforcement stepped in to restore the order, the situation deteriorated even further. Rather than calming the crowd, the police became the new target of the fans' anger in Amsterdam, leading to even greater disorder. However, this incident transcended any soccer rivalry. The underlying political and cultural tensions between the two groups transformed the riot into something far more significant than a typical sports fight. For many participants, the stadium morphed into an emotional battleground where frustrations that extended well beyond the game and erupted into violence. For us looking at this incident now, this flight into violence highlights how group dynamics and de-individuation is able to heighten emotions and drive people to behave in ways that typically wouldn't. In the heat of the moment, the crowd's energy overtook individual spectators, making part of a larger, more perilous force. Another infamous example of mob behavior, though not in a sports context, is the spiraling that occurred at Woodstock 1999. The music festival intended to celebrate peace and unity descended into chaos as attendees, overwhelmed by extreme summer heat, lack of affordable water, no access to sanitary restrooms, and frustration over corporate greed, $10 for a bottle of water, became increasingly aggressive. What started as sporadic outbursts of frustration turned into widespread destruction. Fires were set, looting broke out, and sexual assaults occurred within the crowd. As the festival's infrastructure collapsed, so did the boundaries of personal responsibility. People who had come for music and celebration found themselves swept up in an atmosphere where law and order no longer seemed to apply. People, quote, broke stuff. The combination of environmental stressors, lack of authority, and collective anger created a perfect storm for mob mentality to take over. Having been in many peace movements, I will add that I don't think there's a strong correlation between professing being a peacenik and living with peace sensibilities. Right? Many people profess peace and love and are abusers or have taken advantage of people this way or that way. And then you add in mob mentality, lots of other things emerge as well. I would like to believe it to be true. I mean, but push back if you disagree and you think those professing peace actually tend to be more peaceful. One of the fundamental questions about mob behavior is why people are more likely to act out of character in a group setting. Psychologists have long studied this phenomenon with theories like de-individuation explaining how individuals lose their personal identity when part of a large crowd. When people feel anonymous and unaccountable, they're more likely to engage in impulsive and sometimes violent behavior. Social proof also plays a role. When others in the group act aggressively, people interpret it as acceptable, even if they normally wouldn't behave that way. An article published in The Atlantic in the 1890s describes this phenomenon succinctly. What particularly characterizes the man of the mob is the entire loss of his personal self. In a dense crowd, not only is our body squeezed and pressed upon, but also our spirit. The emotional charge of the moment combined with the overwhelming presence of a group overrides individual moral reasoning. Given the dangers of mob violence, researchers and authorities have explored ways to prevent these outbreaks before they spiral out of control. Strategies include controlling crowd density, providing clear exit routes, and ensuring proper law enforcement presence to discourage escalation. Psychological approaches suggest that reducing anonymity, such as increasing surveillance, interesting in regards to our conversation last week about surveillance, or encouraging personal accountability within groups, can help curb mob behavior. Additionally, proactive de-escalation tactics like diverting aggression through controlled outlets or clear communication with crowds have been shown to reduce the likelihood of violence. By the way, I not to sound overly partisan, but I've been to some Democratic Party rallies, and the energy there has been very well managed and controlled, and I'm sure that's very intentional. I'm not exactly sure what's going on within MAGA rallies. There's not so many reports of MAGA, folks beating up other MAGA folks. But I know there's an energy there that is intended to create a certain intensity. Nonetheless, on both sides of the political aisle, it's worth thinking about the energy that's fostered in political spaces as well. Beyond riots and destruction, mob mentality also plays a role in crowd crush disasters, where sheer physical force leads to deadly consequences. This occurs when people in a densely packed crowd push forward, either out of excitement or panic, causing a wave-like effect where individuals lose control of their own movements. One of the deadliest examples of this is the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca, where millions of people gather for religious rituals in confined spaces. Over the years, multiple stampedes have occurred, with the 2015 incident killing over 2,000 people. In these situations, survival instincts take over, and people unknowingly contribute to a tragic pressure cooker. Similar human calamities have happened in India, where massive religious gatherings like the Kumbh Mela have also led to fatal stampedes. The psychology of these events is rooted in panic and crowd density. When people feel trapped, their instinct is to move towards an exit, but in a densely packed environment, this only increases the pressure on those ahead. Just like people hear of financial challenges and they rush to pull their money out of the bank, and what that panic leads to of bank collapses, mortgage collapses, all these types of things that we've witnessed, like in 2008. The physical force of thousands of bodies moving as one makes it nearly impossible for individuals to stop or escape, leading to suffocation and trampling. These events highlight how mob mentality is not always about aggression, but can always emerge from sheer survival instincts in high-pressure situations. The key factor in preventing crowd crush tragedies is better crowd control and planning. Organizers of large gatherings must anticipate movement patterns, provide sufficient space for exits, and use barriers effectively to prevent overcrowding. In places like Mecca and India, technology like real-time monitoring and AI-driven crowd management has been implemented to reduce the risks of stampedes. Despite these efforts, human behavior remains unpredictable, and understanding the psychological triggers of crowd movement remains a crucial area of study. While different forms of mob behavior may seem unrelated, riots, celebrations, protests, stampedes, rallies, they all stem from the same psychological mechanisms. Whether it's a soccer riot, a festival gone wrong, or a religious gathering, the loss of individual control in a group setting can have serious, even deadly consequences. Recognizing the early signs of mob mentality and implementing preventative measures are crucial to minimizing harm and ensuring crowd safety. Mob behavior will always be a part of human psychology, but understanding it can help societies manage large groups more effectively. From law enforcement to event organizers, those responsible for public safety must consider the factors that contribute to escalation. The key lies in balancing crowd energy with control, allowing people to express emotions, whether in celebration or protest, without letting chaos take over. Now, Jewish tradition has long stood against mob behavior, recognizing its dangers both historically and ethically. One of the strongest reasons of this opposition comes from Jewish history itself. Jews have often been the victims of mob violence, most notably in pogroms. Throughout the centuries, anti-Semitic mobs have carried out violent attacks against Jewish communities, fueled by scapegoating, irrational fears, and collective hysteria. These mobs didn't seek justice or solutions. They existed purely to unleash destruction on a perceived enemy. The Jewish experience of being on the receiving end of mob violence has reinforced the deep cultural and religious belief that mobs are inherently dangerous, driven by unchecked emotion rather than reason. Jewish philosophy has long grappled with the ethics of participating in violent spectacles. Today, we think about violent sports like boxing or football. In the early rabbinic era, the sages thought particularly deeply about the ethics of Roman gladiator games, as we've touched upon in the past here. The mainstream rabbinic stance was clear. Attending these brutal events was forbidden. Now, it's funny. Today, when we hear in the Haredi world, people saying you shouldn't go to movies, you shouldn't go to sports games, maybe certain sports games, you shouldn't go to music conferences, we might feel that's overly pure, right? Be a part of society, right? And I'm sure the same critics were a part then as well. Now, 2,000 years later, it's easier for us to say, ugh, gross event. But when you're a part of that time, it feels obvious to be a part of society. The mainstream rabbinic stance was clear. Attending these brutal events was forbidden. These games were far from the grand stage confrontations portrayed in contemporary films, where strong fighters willingly engage in combat in the Colosseum. In truth, these events were savage, horrific, and exploitative, involving enslaved individuals and condemned offenders who were compelled to battle to the death for the amusement of the crowd. Simply being a spectator made one an accomplice in this cruelty, reinforcing a system that profited from human misery. The Jewish moral tradition condemns such participation, asserting that observing this violence without objection amounted to tacit approval. Of course, speaking out in the face of a bloodthirsty crowd would have been incredibly dangerous. The overwhelming force of mob mentality pressures individuals to conform, making acts of defiance rare and costly. History is filled with examples of people who chose to stand against mass atrocity and paid the price for it. From those who resisted the Roman spectacles to figures in later history who opposed public executions, lynchings, or even modern political violence, there's always been a moral struggle between going along with the masses and resisting injustice. The Talmud itself warns against silence in the face of wrongdoing, stating that remaining quiet in such situations is akin to complicity. When a mob commits an act of violence, the bystanders who say nothing may not throw the stones themselves, but their silence gives implicit approval to the actions of the group. The case of Reish Lakish adds another layer to the discussion. Reish Lakish, a Jewish sage, was a gladiator himself who sold himself into combat. A reminder that not all participants in these brutal spectacles were willing combatants. Some Jews facing extreme poverty found themselves on both sides of the arena. It's well documented. Some were forced into combat, where others were enslaved and thrown into the spectacle of helpless victims. The presence of Jews in these brutal games raised difficult ethical questions. What does it mean to be a religious minority within a society that normalizes violence? How should one navigate a world where survival sometimes means compromising one's principles? For figures like Reish Lakish, escaping the gladiatorial world and rejoining the Jewish scholarly tradition was itself an act of redemption. This historical debate also touches on a broader tension in Jewish thought, the balance between standing apart from society and remaining part of the larger community. Judaism places a strong emphasis on community solidarity. These teachings suggest that God's presence is found among the collective gathering of Jews. But what happens when the values of the surrounding society contradict Jewish ethics? The challenge is navigating between remaining part of a larger group and knowing when moral duty requires stepping away, even if that means isolation or personal risk. Yet there's a notable dissenting opinion. Rabbi Natan, from that same sugya, the same Talmudic passage, took a different approach, arguing that a Jew can attend the gladiator games, but only under specific conditions. His reasoning was twofold, as explained in the Talmud. This issue is a dispute between Tanaim. As it is taught, one may not go to stadiums because they're considered the seat of the scornful, leitzanut. And Rabbi Natan permits due to two reasons. One is because he can scream and save the life of someone who would otherwise be killed. And the other one is because even if he cannot save the man's life, he can provide testimony that a woman's husband died, which will enable her to marry again. Right? If there's no witnesses to say that he died, he can't remarry. So he can serve that purpose. The discussion of Jewish perspectives on gladiator games is about more than just history. It's about the enduring question of how individuals respond to societal cruelty. Do they look away, refusing to engage? Do they join in, swept up by the force of the crowd? Or do they, like Rabbi Natan suggested, speak out even when doing so is very dangerous? The question remains as relevant now as it was in ancient Rome, reminding us that the fight against mob mentality is an ongoing moral struggle. Beyond history, Jewish thought sees mob mentality as a rejection of reason and morality. A mob does not deliberate or analyze. It acts impulsively, often driven by anger, fear, or a desire for vengeance. In this way, mobs are more animalistic than rational, following instinct rather than ethics. Jewish tradition, on the other hand, prioritizes debate, discussion, and the exchange of ideas. The Talmud itself is built on the foundation of argument, one sage presenting a view, another offering a counterpoint, and both perspectives being preserved for study. Even when Jewish scholars disagreed profoundly, they did not advocate for silencing or physically attacking their opponents. Instead, the Jewish model is one of intellectual engagement rather than violent confrontation. The Torah explicitly warns against following a crowd towards wrongdoing. As it says, you shall neither side with the mighty or the multitude to do wrong. This verse serves as a direct rejection, a biblical rejection of mob behavior. It reminds people that just because a large group supports an action does not make it right. Moral responsibility is placed on the individual even when surrounded by a mass of people acting in unison. The Jewish perspective is that truth and justice are not determined by numbers or volume, but by righteousness and thoughtful consideration. The dangers of mob rule can also be seen in biblical stories. Sodom is one example of a society where mob behavior became the norm, with cruelty and violence overtaking morality. The people of Sodom were not just wicked as individuals, their collective cruelty made it impossible for justice to exist. Visitors were mistreated, the vulnerable were exploited, and kindness was viewed as weakness. The city's fate was sealed because its moral decay was so deeply embedded that there was no hope of reform. The story reinforces the idea that when a society allows mob mentality to dominate, it loses its ethical foundation. By the way, I do believe in the biblical prohibition of sodomy, and by which I mean primarily the abuse of strangers and immigrants and refugees. But what I mean secondarily is the forcible anal sex, where it is not complicit, a form of abuse that occurs. And I think what that prohibition is referring to is non-complicit anal sex. Okay, that's beyond the scope of our current conversation. But since we're talking about Sodom and what happens in forced crowds, also in jails, there's lots of rape in jails for various reasons from people who are not even gay. Another biblical example comes from the story of Nineveh in the book of Jonah. Initially, Nineveh was a place engaged in mob-like behavior, filled with corruption, violence, and injustice. And unlike Sodom, the people of Nineveh had the capacity for change. When Jonah reluctantly delivered his message of impending destruction, the citizenry listened, repented, and reversed their wicked ways. This narrative presents a counterpoint to the typical fate of mob-driven societies. When individuals step back from the collective frenzy and embrace self-reflection, transformation is possible. Instead of being swept up by the crowd, each person took personal responsibility for their actions, leading to their redemption. One of the key dangers of mobs is their tendency to scapegoat. Rather than seeking real solutions to problems, mobs look for someone or something to blame. This phenomenon is played out countless times in Jewish history, where economic downturns, plagues, or political socioeconomic instability led to Jews being falsely accused and attacked. But scapegoating isn't just an issue of historical persecution. It presents a broader failure of reason and justice. A society that defaults to mob violence is one that abandons rational problem solving in favor of quick, destructive emotional release. Jewish tradition warns against this kind of thinking, encouraging intellectual inquiry, structured debate, and ethical leadership instead. Mob mentality also involves ceding individual reason for the sake of an immediate goal. Whether it's a riot, a lynching, or even a social media pile-on in the modern era, the essence of a mob is that it demands immediate action without reflection. This runs counter to Jewish values, which emphasize patience, deliberation, and long-term thinking. The concept of seichel, intelligence, is deeply valued in Jewish thought, and acting impulsively, especially in a destructive way, is seen as a rejection of wisdom. Even in moments of great anger or injustice, Jewish tradition teaches that response should be measured and guided by moral principles, not mob fervor. While Jewish tradition places great emphasis on sibur, community and unity, it draws a sharp line between constructive communal engagement and destructive mob behavior. Hillel remarks in the Mishnah, do not separate yourself from the community, meaning that Jewish life is meant to be lived as a part of a collective. However, this does not mean blind conformity. A person is not expected to follow the masses when they're doing wrong. The balance lies in being part of a community while maintaining a personal moral compass. Another teaching states, a numerous people is the glory of the king, which accentuates the value of a large gatherings for positive purposes, such as prayer or celebration rather than destruction. Jewish tradition places great importance on rabbinic authority and the necessity of structured decision-making. Yet it also warns against blind conformity and the dangers of mob mentality. This tension is exemplified in the law of the rebellious elder, known as the Zakin Mamre, which states that an elder who rules against the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Rabbinic Court, can be punished for defying the majority. The principle behind the law aligns with the concept of achrei rabim lahatot, the principle to follow the majority, a foundational idea in Jewish legal decision-making. Initially, this principle implies that even the most knowledgeable individuals may need to temporarily suspend their personal judgment in favor of the consensus established by acknowledged authorities. Nevertheless, this prompts a critical inquiry. At what point does respect for authority transform into perilous conformity? One could argue that the Zakin Mamre ruling highlights the importance of centralized authority and a structured system of legal interpretation rather than an endorsement of mob rule. The Sanhedrin was not an impulsive, emotion-driven assembly, but a carefully structured institution where debate, dissent, and intellectual rigor were encouraged. The purpose of requiring individuals to follow its rulings was to maintain legal consistency and avoid anarchy, not to stifle independent thinking. In contrast, a mob is defined by emotional impulsivity, peer pressure, and the suppression of dissent. The difference between legitimate rabbinic authority and dangerous groupthink is the presence of careful deliberation and moral integrity. The Zakin Mamre law applies only within the structured framework of the Sanhedrin, not to any random group of people who form a consensus. This suggests that a Jewish person must think for themselves when confronted with mob acting on emotion rather than reason, but should respect the rules of structured, wise leadership like the Sanhedrin. Even if this is a great conversational debate later, even when I disagree with the Supreme Court in America, I respect the rule of law in America, where, there's a judicial branch that, we might want to continue challenging it and hope for a better outcome, but respecting a rule of law in America, to a certain degree, of course, but okay, we'll just talk about that later. This distinction is highlighted by one of the most fascinating rules in Jewish law. If the Sanhedrin unanimously decides to sentence someone to death, we've discussed this before, that person is actually set free. At first glance, this seems puzzling. What? Why would a court release someone if all the judges agree on their guilt? The reasoning behind this law is quite profound. If not a single judge can find even a hint of innocence, it indicates that a kind of mob mentality, rather than genuine deliberation, has taken hold. The Sanhedrin was meant to encourage a variety of perspectives, making sure that every case was looked at from different angles. A unanimous death sentence raised red flags. Perhaps fear, bias, or social pressure had stifled any dissenting opinions. The rule reflects a deep-rooted Jewish skepticism towards absolute agreement, acknowledging that true justice thrives on diverse viewpoints. Essentially, even within a structured authority, Judaism aims to guard against the pitfalls of groupthink, unchecked certainty, and the neglect of critical analysis. The challenge for any society is determining when one should defer to the wisdom of others and when they should think independently and resist the crowd. Judaism values both community and independent thought, both deference to leadership and the courage to challenge injustice. The balance between these principles is not always easy to navigate, but Jewish law and history provide deep insights into the tension between following the crowd and maintaining one's moral and intellectual integrity. Okay, friends, there's so much more I want to say, but I've already said way too much. So please let me pause here, and I'd love to open the conversation around all these different ideas that we've raised together.
Good morning. I wanted to, I guess, extrapolate a bit when you were talking about the gladiators and the mob violence. And I wanted to say that I think we're experiencing that now. The mob violence is the party that is currently in power, and their violence is against the vulnerable communities. So when they cut Medicaid, when they cut SNAP, when they pass all of these horrible cuts to budgets and money that is literally causing the deaths of vulnerable communities, that to me is mob violence. So what do we do? Do we become part of that? And then that's the quote that went with Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Well, thank goodness what we're seeing is people rallying, all of the protests that we see, letter writing, phone calls, everything. So I think there's a resistance, if you will, that is happening. That's been wonderful to see. We're not accepting this. We're not being part of the mob violence and losing our own values and commitment to the vulnerable communities. When you were talking about respect for the majority versus mob rule, you talked about the emotional impulsivity. And I was thinking that, yeah, I'll say it. When the Trump administration is doing all of its evil, legislation and so forth, that may not be emotional impulsivity so much as strategic violence. This is something that's been building for decades. And that's it. There are a lot of thinking today, like there is every Tuesday.
Awesome, Janie. It's so nice. It's so nice to see you and learn from you. Thank you for that. And you're right about the mob violence. And one of the things that it does to us is some of us can start to think that a certain viewpoint is legitimate because such a large segment of society believes it. I know people like this. And in the name of tolerance or in the name of pluralism, you know what? That's a valid view too, that we're going to cut all the SNAP benefits and, cut this social welfare and that social welfare, and just a few really smart people are able to write some intellectual justification of why it's actually good for society in a way that makes someone, forget the mob violence that is occurring. So thank you for that. And I think an additional response, in addition to the rallies and the resistance and the cultural, renaissance that needs to occur, emerges going back to Sodom. I've never heard somebody say this, but it speaks so true to me. The Midrash says that in Sodom, they would cut off the feet of strangers so that they would fit in the small beds. Rather than getting a bigger bed for a guest, they'd cut the feet off the strangers. Now, what happens with Abraham? Abraham, when three stranger Arabs come to his tent, he asks Sarah to rush to get water to wash their feet so they can wash their feet. Now that's interesting because Jews don't wash feet. But I view it as a response to the mob violence is cutting people's feet off. So extra kindness towards the feet of strangers. So I think when we see mob violence, one of the things it should do, in addition to calling it out, if we can, is to do extra kindness to those who are losing out. I'm happy to share. It's not public yet, but VBM is now launching a pantry, a major pantry effort. We already have our humanitarian buses that go out, but now in partnership with St. Mary's Food Bank, in partnership with the Diaper Bank, for supporting low-income families, expanding a space where people who are really losing benefits and are really struggling can come to be supported. And so there's a lot more to say about that. But Janie, thank you.
Can I just, I got an email from Robert Reich this morning, and I think it fits here. So if I could it'll just take 30 seconds. He said, living a moral life in an age of bullies, excuse me, requires collective action. So it's a mob mentality, but in reverse. It cannot be done alone. Each of us must organize and participate in a vast network of moral resistance. This is what civilization demands. It's what the struggle for social justice requires. It's why that struggle is so critical today and why we must all be part of it.
Okay, Ken and then Sarah.
I guess I had a very negative reaction to the ideas today. And part of that is because I don't believe that people who are not predisposed to violence commit violence when in a mob. Because you think of most of the examples you gave, the great majority of people who are in those crowds don't participate. They don't do violent acts. They don't burn cars. They don't overturn vehicles. They don't do graffiti. It's a small minority in the mob that takes advantage of being in a mob in order to act the way they truly are. They can act in their normal societally negative way because they have the anonymity. So I don't believe that mobs cause the violence. I think mobs allow the violence. They make it easier to commit the violence. They make it easier to be antisocial. And that's, it's bad enough, but I don't believe that there really is this thing of mob rule. And the same thing's true of what Janie just said. From my perspective, it's even worse than it being, due to being in a mob. What the regime is doing is purposeful. It wasn't caused by a lot of people getting together. It was caused by a small cabal of people wanting to do evil. As Robert Reich and Janie said, the answer to that is the mob. The answer to that is a peaceful reaction of large numbers of people saying, no, what you're doing is immoral. And so it's a difficult thing to really, put all that together. And then as a lawyer, I had a really terrible reaction to your description of the Sanhedrin.
You want to say more?
In the sense that what I heard you say, and I'm not sure, I may have misheard you, was that you couldn't criticize the Sanhedrin if once it had ruled. And yet, when you describe our current Supreme Court, which supposedly acts on the same intellectual basis of reason and law, I think it's morally imperative to criticize our current Supreme Court, because what it's doing, in fact, isn't following the law and is following its own desire for power and to increase the power of its party. There were so many things you touched on today, but it was a very difficult discussion. So I'll leave it at
good.
that.
Thank you. Fascinating stuff, Ken. Thank you so much. Hi, Sarah.
Gosh, just having listened to Janie and Ken, now I'm even more riled up and confused. So in response to Janie, yeah, I realized this weekend that I feel as if I'm in a war zone, that I don't know which bomb is going to hit me next from either my federal government or my state government or my local government, and telling me I cannot serve the people I am bound to serve. And who is going to suffer next? And I realize I'm in such a position of privilege to be able to say, I have a chance to try and make a difference in spite of all of these people. And so many of those who are being disenfranchised don't. So it's even more of a moral imperative for me. When I heard about the Sanhedrin piece, I guess I got even a little confused, because I saw on the one hand that if the Sanhedrin all was in agreement, then there was the release of the prisoner, because we're not supposed to all agree. And yet, once the Sanhedrin ruled, we were all supposed to agree with whatever they said, regardless of what truth or reality or, okay, so if the Supreme Court rules, I'm just supposed to go along with this nonsense? Are you kidding me? And what is it going to take to I see it as at least 80 years of work back together again. I mean, it took 80 years to create the social networks that we've created, such as they are. The total dissolution of all of that work will take, I'm guessing, if we last that long, hundreds of years. So, there's so much in what you said. And you're right, I don't join those crowds. But I'm really fascinated that what we didn't get into was the neural piece of how much, when you look at a mob, I would want to look at what's going on in their prefrontal cortex. Here, I've got 50,000 students at IU, and when something exciting happens, they all go berserk. If indeed there's a game and somebody wins, then, yes, we can have all of the mob violence. And I think of them as being well under the age of 25, and they don't have a well-developed prefrontal cortex. So judgment, it was already out the window. Now it's even more likely that people will do things in response to Ken that they might never think of doing until they are surrounded by other crazy people doing crazy stuff that they either saw online and thought, oh, cool, let's do that. Or just being so inventive, because after all, they're college students. They're supposed to be creative and doing stupid things. So, yeah, I don't join in those mobs. And the option that wasn't given to me in the poll was, no, I really don't want to hang out in a crowded space, especially without a mask, with people that are so unpredictable, particularly people without well-developed prefrontal cortexes. There you go. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. It's great to be with you all today and to learn from you. And I'm excited to continue next Tuesday with Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura passed away just 4 years ago, and the Bobo doll experiment and some things that emerged from that study. So looking forward to seeing you then, and hopefully before then as well. Have a good day and a meaningful Tisha B'Av to anyone who engages.